In an emotional moment that shook the nation, Donald Trump Jr. led a heartfelt prayer honoring his close friend Charlie Kirk, who was tragically assassinated during a campus event in Utah. With millions watching, Trump Jr.'s words brought America to tears as he remembered Kirk's fight for conservative values and freedom. This powerful tribute is one of the most moving moments in recent U.S. history, leaving viewers across the nation grieving and united in sorrow. The campus of Utah Valley University had been buzzing with excitement on that fateful afternoon. Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist who had inspired millions of young Americans, was on stage answering tough questions with his usual calmness and conviction. Then, in one shattering instant, everything changed forever. A sudden crack split the air, echoing through the packed auditorium. Students screamed in terror as the horrifying reality dawned on them. Security personnel rushed forward toward the stage where Kirk had been speaking. Within seconds, chaos erupted throughout the venue as panic spread like wildfire. Charlie collapsed on the stage, his hand clutching his chest as crimson spread across his shirt. The crowd scattered in terror, the sound of running feet echoing in the arena as people fled for safety. The shooter slipped away into the gathering darkness, leaving behind devastation and unanswered questions that would haunt a nation. News alerts flashed across phones within minutes, delivering the unthinkable headline to millions of Americans. Charlie Kirk, shot at Utah Valley University, read the notification that would stop hearts nationwide. Across America, living rooms filled with stunned silence and disbelief as the news spread. Tears streamed down faces as people realized what had just happened to the young conservative leader. Social media exploded with expressions of sorrow and anger at the senseless violence. In Washington, Donald Trump Jr. was pulled aside from a meeting in the West Wing by a solemn-faced aide. He froze as he read the incoming message on his phone, unable to process the words before him. His hands trembled visibly as the reality sank, and his closest friend, more like a brother than a colleague, had been taken by an act of pure evil. In that moment, Don Jr.'s world cracked open before him, and America braced for what would become the most painful prayer it would ever witness. Sirens wailed across Utah as federal agents swarmed the university campus in force. The shooter had vanished, but the hunt was only beginning as law enforcement mobilized at unprecedented speed. Helicopters hovered overhead, powerful searchlights sweeping across rooftops and parking structures. Students wept in the parking lot, some clutching each other for support, others frantically calling parents to assure them of their safety. Charlie's voice, the one that had once calmed, challenged, and inspired millions, was now silenced forever. President Donald Trump, visibly shaken and furious, addressed the nation from the Oval Office within hours of the shooting. This cowardly attack on Charlie Kirk was not just an attack on a man, the president declared solemnly. It was an attack on America's soul, on our fundamental freedoms, on our very way of life. We will find the perpetrator of this heinous act, he promised the nation. Justice will be swift and justice will be unforgiving for this attack on our democracy. But even as the president's words rang across the airwaves, it was Donald Trump Jr. whom Americans waited anxiously to hear from. Everyone knew how incredibly close he and Charlie had been throughout the years of building the conservative movement. Everyone waited for Trump Jr.'s voice, his prayer, his tribute to the friend who had stood beside him through countless battles. Don Jr. sat alone in his office, head bowed low under the weight of grief too heavy to bear. Reporters gathered outside, waiting respectfully for any statement from the man who had lost his dearest friend. His staff whispered that the cameras were ready whenever he felt able to speak. But Don Jr. wasn't thinking about cameras or public statements in that moment of raw grief. He was thinking about the last hug Charlie had given him just 3 days earlier at a campaign event in Michigan. He was remembering the last time Charlie had said, "I'm praying for you, brother," before boarding his flight to Utah. Now, it was Don Jr. who needed to pray for his fallen friend before a watching nation. The White House press briefing room was eerily silent as journalists awaited his arrival. It wasn't the usual restless silence filled with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. This was a heavy silence like the air before a devastating storm breaks over vulnerable land. Donald Trump Jr. walked in slowly, his face pale and drawn, his eyes visibly red from tears he had shed in private. The cameras clicked softly, but no reporter spoke a single question as he approached the podium. Even the journalists, so often sharp and combative in their questioning, were subdued by the palpable grief filling the room. He placed his hands on the podium, gripping it tightly as though steadying himself against a powerful wave of emotion. He paused, gathering whatever strength remained within him for the words that must be spoken. For a long moment, he couldn't speak at all, the silence stretching out as America held its collective breath. Then, with a trembling voice that betrayed his shattered heart, he began the address that would unite a divided nation in grief. "The brutal murder of Charlie Kirk is nothing short of evil incarnate," he began, his voice breaking on the words. "A cowardly attack on America's very soul has taken from us one of our brightest lights." His voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on, his words heavy with the grief of personal loss. Charlie was a Christian who had accepted Jesus as his Savior and lived that faith every day of his life. Tonight we know the Lord is greeting him, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." Some in the press room wept openly at the raw emotion in Trump Jr.'s voice. Others bowed their heads in respect for the fallen conservative leader. Across the country, millions of Americans watched as Donald Trump Jr. struggled through his tears to honor his. Shifted uncomfortably, but Vance's expression remained unchanged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what I see, Marcus? I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something, these values, the ones I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, don't change with your zip code or your job title." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "So you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition, that we should just ignore your past criticisms, that we should accept that you're now President Trump's new—" He paused, letting the word hang. Puppet. The word struck the room like a thrown gauntlet, and several audience members gasped audibly. Vance's response came with the precision of a master chess player. "You know, Marcus, that word puppet reveals more about you than it does about me." His voice measured, yet laced with steel, continued. "In your world, maybe strong loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock, but let me tell you what I learned as a Marine." He leaned forward slightly. "In combat, you learn to judge a person's character by their actions, not by what the media says about them. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created." The audience erupted into applause. Bennett tried to interject, but Vance pressed on. "You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it, and yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump." Bennett's voice dripped with sarcasm. "A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once criticized." "There you go again," Marcus replied calmly. "You're so focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the point entirely. The real contradiction is ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes just to please critics like yourself." Thunderous applause followed his words. Bennett glanced at his producer, who gestured frantically from the sidelines, but Vance wasn't finished. "And since you brought up my intellectual background," he added with a slight smile, "it just goes to show that true wisdom isn't measured by how many contradictions you can find, but by the strength to learn and grow. Why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty in your coverage of this administration?" Marcus Bennett began, his tone edged with accusation. "My coverage?" He shot back sharply. "We're here to discuss it." J.D. Vance interjected smoothly, "because just last week you devoted an entire segment to questioning my faith, suggesting it was nothing more than convenient election season Christianity." Bennett's face reneged. "I was merely pointing out the timing." He started, but Vance leaned forward, cutting him off. "The timing of what exactly?" "The fact that I've been attending the same church since before I entered politics. Or perhaps you'd like to question my grandmother's faith too, the woman who taught me to pray before every meal even when we had little to share." A woman in the front row nodded vigorously at his words. "Let me be clear," Marcus Vance continued, his voice carrying both strength and dignity. "You can question my politics, you can disagree with my decisions, but when you start suggesting that my faith is nothing more than a political prop, you're not just attacking me, you're attacking every American who holds their faith dear." Bennett glanced at his notes, clearly searching for safer ground. "Let's talk about your recent statements," he insisted. "Yes, let's talk about statements." Vance agreed, "like your remark last month that anyone who supports traditional values is, and I quote, living in the past." Tell me, Marcus, do you really think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who believe in family values, who love their country, are they all just living in the past? A defining silence fell over the studio as Bennett's carefully crafted persona began to crumble. He fumbled with his papers. "Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around," he stammered. "No," Marcus Vance said steadily. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues seem to have for regular Americans. You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, and my support for the president. But let's talk about what really bothers you." The studio grew quiet, every eye fixed on him. "It bothers you," Vance continued, "that someone can come from where I come from and not subscribe to your worldview. It bothers you that I can be EdUC at Yale Law School, and still hold traditional values, and most of all it bothers you that I can see right through the game you're playing. Bennett attempted to regain control. Your accusations are. Vance's expression hardened for the first time. They're not accusations, Marcus, they're observations, like how you rolled your eyes when I mentioned prayer earlier, or how you mockingly referred to my hometown as Trump country on your show last week. His rebuke hit like a thunderclap, leaving the audience in stunned silence. You see, this isn't about politics, Vance continued, his voice firm, but controlled. It's about respect for faith, for traditional values, for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country or support their president. Bennett's face drained of color as he glanced at his producer, who now watched the exchange with a mix of concern and fascination. Clearly the interview had dead. Far from Bennett's planned ambush. Perhaps we should move on. Bennett began checking his watch. I noticed you've been doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values, Vance observed with a slight smile. Uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus. A few chuckles rose from the audience as Bennett's discomfort became plain to see for someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism. Vance went on, you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way. Bennett tried one last attack. Is this the same kind of deflection you used when you switched from criticizing Trump to praising him? There you go again, Marcus. Vance replied calmly. You keep coming back to that, don't you? Let me ask you something. Have you ever changed? With posts bearing Charlie Kirk's photo and expressions of shock and sorrow. Some carried Bible verses offering comfort for such a time of national mourning. Others shared raw grief in simple, heartfelt words that needed no embellishment. Thousands posted the same simple message across platforms. Pray for Erica. Pray for the Kirk children. Don Jr. understood profoundly the weight of responsibility that had fallen upon his shoulders in this moment. His words would not just be for himself, not just for Charlie's immediate family, but for the soul of a wounded nation seeking healing. His wife entered his office quietly before the broadcast, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder in silent support. You can do this, she whispered, her eyes reflecting his pain. You're speaking for all of us tonight. He nodded in acknowledgement, but his eyes betrayed the emotional storm raging inside him. He whispered under his breath, Lord, give me strength to honor my friend properly before this nation. And somewhere in that silent moment of prayer, America held its breath with him, waiting for whatever would come next. Donald Trump Jr. stepped out from his office, surrounded by solemn Secret Service agents who shared in the national grief. The hallways of the White House, usually buzzing with staff and activity, had fallen uncharacteristically silent out of respect. White House staffers stood against the walls with re-ened eyes, some whispering prayers of their own for the slain conservative leader. As Don Jr. walked toward the briefing room, every step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the responsibility of the moment. He could hear the muffled sound of reporters beyond the doors, the low hum of cameras waiting to capture what would become a historic address. He carried no prepared notes or teleprompter text for this most personal of moments. He had decided that every word tonight would come straight from his heart, unfiltered and authentic in his grief. At the doorway, he paused momentarily, gripping the frame for balance as emotions threatened to overwhelm him again. Images of Charlie flashed through his mind in rapid succession, laughing backstage at events, speaking passionately to crowds, showing pictures of his children with pride. The weight of those memories nearly broke his composure completely, but somehow he steadied himself for the nation's sake. When the doors opened and he entered the room, a profound silence fell over the assembled press corps. Reporters lowered their heads respectfully, sensing the gravity of what they were about to witness. Millions watching at home and around the world leaned closer to their screens, but the silence was so thick it seemed the entire world had stopped spinning to listen. Donald Trump Jr. stepped up to the podium with measured steps, his grief evident in every movement. His voice trembled noticeably as he began to speak again to the American people. Don Jr. took a deep breath, his hands tightening visibly on the edges of the podium as he looked straight into the cameras. His lips parted, but for a long moment no sound came as emotion threatened to overwhelm him completely. Finally, his voice, raw and heavy with unfiltered emotion, broke the silence that had fallen over the room. The brutal murder of Charlie Kirk is nothing short of evil unleashed upon our nation. He began, each word cutting through the stillness. A cowardly attack on America's very soul has robbed us of a true patriot in his prime. The words cut through the air like a knife, reaching into homes across the divided nation. His voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on despite the pain evident in every syllable. Faith, family, freedom. the right to speak truth without fear. These principles have been trampled by violence today. My blood boils at this attack on a peaceful voice for conservative values. Justice must be relentless and unforgiving for the person who committed this heinous act. He paused briefly, his chest rising and falling as he fought back a fresh wave of tears before continuing. Charlie Kirk was a Christian who accepted Jesus Christ as his personal savior and lived to that faith authentically every day. Tonight, I know with absolute certainty that the Lord is greeting him, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Across living rooms and churches throughout America, people wept openly at the raw display of grief. Pastors and evening services replayed Don Jr.'s words for congregations gathered in impromptu prayer circles. Families watching together bowed their heads in silent respect, regardless of political affiliation. Don Jr.'s personal grief became the nation's shared grief in that powerful moment of human connection. His voice carried not just sorrow for a fallen friend, but a fierce promise that such an attack on free speech would not stand. Charlie Kirk's fight for truth and freedom would not die with him, but would be carried forward by countless inspired by his example. As Trump Jr.'s heartfelt words echoed across America, living rooms fell silent in shared mourning. People sat frozen before their screens, clinging to every syllable of comfort offered. Some bowed their heads in prayer for the Kirk family's unimaginable loss. Others wiped away unexpected tears, surprised by the depth of emotion they felt for someone many had only seen on television. In small-town churches across rural America, pastors replayed the memorial address through speakers for evening prayer services. In college dormitories, students who had once debated Kirk's ideas vigorously now whispered in disbelief that his voice had been permanently silenced. Don Jr.'s trembling words reached across the political divides that had seemed so insurmountable just days before. For one extraordinary night, Americans of all political persuasions felt the same wound to their national soul. It wasn't just about politics anymore in the face of such senseless violence. It was about the loss of a husband, a father, a son, a friend, a man who had dared to live with conviction, regardless of criticism. On social media, the hashtag #pray for Charlie Kirk shot to the top of trending lists worldwide. Strangers shared their grief as though they had lost someone from their own inner circle of loved ones. "I never met him," one woman posted with heartbreaking simplicity. "But tonight, I feel like I've lost my own brother." Inside,